In part 3 of our Summer Faith series. There's a little handout sheet in your bulletins you want to grab. So as you know, our children are in the midst of Vacation Bible School, so are we. So they're ending theirs today. We still got a couple weeks, depending on, well, how long I want to talk, but a couple more weeks. As you know, our kind of topic this year for our adult Vacation Bible School is, who is Jesus? Remember, we kind of have as our springboard what C.S. Lewis says you could say about Jesus. You only say one of 4 things about Jesus. He was a liar, that he knew he wasn't God, yet he proclaimed he was God. He was a lunatic. He really believed he was God, but he really wasn't. Brother Jason's third, he's legend, and that's kind of what we talked about last week when we talked about the authenticity of the Gospels, that kind of all this stuff that we know about Jesus was kind of dumped on him decades and centuries later. That he really was just a really good rabbi who was a good teacher and a good example. Then all this God stuff kind of got dumped on him later on, especially by the time you got to the Gospel of John. And the 4th thing you can say about Jesus is that he's Lord. Liar, lunatic, legend, or Lord. Those are our options. Last week we talked about the authenticity of the Gospels. We kind of looked at internal evidence. We looked at external evidence as to the 4 evangelists actually being the people that actually composed it, contrary to some biblical scholarship. We looked at probably the dating of the Gospels is actually earlier. Okay, and today we're going to tackle the question of, did Jesus say he was God? You'll hear that a lot when you get to CNN around Christmas and Easter and all kinds of documentaries on Jesus. Did Jesus think and or say he was God? So open up your little sheets. You're going to see your Summer Faith series, Who is Jesus? We're going to go right to the number 1 objection. Some of you may have heard of this guy, Bart Ehrman. He wrote a book, How Jesus Became God. I came to learn about him on the Stephen Colbert Report, believe it or not. When I first saw him several years ago, and he and Stephen were getting into an interesting debate. Stephen Colbert is a Catholic, by the way, who actually knows quite a bit about theology, so it's interesting to watch him kind of argue. But Bart Ehrman is a professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And this is one of his quotes. So we're going to start with his objection. If Jesus went around Galilee proclaiming himself to be a divine being sent from God, could anything else that he might say be so breathtaking and thunderously important? And yet, none of these earlier sources mean Mark, Luke, and Matthew, says any such thing about him. Did they, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, just not to decide to mention the one thing that was most significant about Jesus? Almost certainly this divine self-claims in John are not historical. He comes from a perspective that John was written much later. Because it's clear in John that Jesus says he's divine. I and the Father are one, for example. That's in John. You don't see that language in Matthew, Luke, and Mark. So it was kind of dumped on Jesus later. He's coming from that school, decades down. But when you go to the historical documents of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because those are really the nitty-gritty ones that were really ancient, Jesus really doesn't declare himself divine. See the argument? Let me destroy it. Okay? You can't read those early Gospels without putting on your first century Jewish ears. That's one of the problems. We're going to look at 3 accounts. And by the way, I'm using a lot from this book here, and I really encourage you to get Brant Pitter's The Case for Jesus, which is extraordinary. We may use this in the adult confirmation class, but more on that about the announcements. This is a really fascinating book, but he kind of uses 3 major episodes that are included in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that you have to see through a first century Jewish mindset. Now, as we talked about last week, when you're looking at the Gospels, when you're looking at ancient historical biographies, they're kind of giving you the substance of the story. Some of the minor details may not agree, but the substance is there. We're going to look at 3 substantial accounts. And the first one of those is the calming of the storm. You have learned about this in Vacation Bible School and in Sunday School, the story of Jesus calming the storm. What is the story of Jesus calming the storm? What's the pieces of that story? There's a boat. All right, we got a boat. The disciples are all terrified. Where's Jesus? He's taking a nap, right? He's asleep in the hall. They're on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. They're in a boat. The boat's rocking. The waves are coming. Jesus is napping. The apostles freak out. We're going to die. Jesus, you may want to wake up. We're going to die. Right? And he gets up. And his slumber comes out and says, knock it off. The storm calms. The wind's calm. And the apostles look at him and look at each other and go, what? That's the substance, right? Boat, storm, Jesus falls asleep. Jesus comes out and says, peace, be still. Everything calms down. And then Jesus goes back to bed. Right? You know it. You probably, when you were in Sunday school, drew pictures, sang little cute songs about it. In the first century Jewish ear, it would have been completely different the way that you heard it. Because remember, they're heavily steeped in Scripture. And if you look at your sheets, what is Scripture? And by Scripture, you obviously mean the Old Testament, because that's what they had and that's what they knew. About calming of waves and calming of storms. There were many people and many prophets in the Old Testament who did miraculous deeds. We read early in the summer, Elijah stopped it from raining. Right? After he prayed to God. It wasn't on his own authority, but after he prayed to God, it stops raining. However, the only person in the Old Testament that by its own power calms the storms and the waves is God alone. So you look at some of these passages. Job 26, 11 through 12. God rebuked, and by his power he stilled the sea. Psalm 106. He rebuked the Red Sea, and it became dry. And listen to this passage now, and I want you to listen now in your first century ears after we just talked about the calming of the storm. Psalm 107, verses 23 through 30. Some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the great waters. Sailors, fishermen. They saw the wondrous deeds of the Lord, his wondrous works in the deep. For he commanded and raised the stormy wind which lifted up the waves of the sea. They mounted up to heaven. They went down to the depths. You can see the waves crashing the boat. Their courage melted away in their evil plight. They reeled and staggered like drunken men, were at their wits' end. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad because they had quiet, and he brought them to their desired heaven. Jesus may not have said in that story, guys, I'm God, I'll just calm the waves. But in doing so, he did something only God does in the Old Testament, which is why they all looked at each other at the end of that and went, who's that? He may not have verbatim said, I am divine, but he acted like it, and the waves calmed. And that's why they were astonished. You may say, oh, well, based on that song, they might have just made up that story and put it in the scriptures. Either way, they believed Jesus was divine. Either way, they believed Jesus was divine. Story number 2. Walking on water. What's the walking on water passage? We got a boat. We got storms. Those poor apostles can never go out on a ship without it being crazy. Right? What happens? We got Peter. Poor Peter. This is where Peter shines. Kind of. Right? Storms happening on the sea. Waves rocking the boat. Jesus, they knew, was on the shore. They went out without him. All of a sudden, in the middle of the night, here comes Jesus walking on water. Right? Peter thinks he's a ghost. Find that walking on water. Have you ever seen that cartoon of Mary and baby Jesus? And he's standing on the bathtub like this, and she's like, in. Right? In. It's funny. So Jesus is walking. Peter thinks he's a ghost, because this is the Jesus we know, right? And what's Jesus say? Take care, I am, do not be afraid. That's really lovely. Don't be afraid. He's constantly telling us in Scripture, don't be afraid, don't be afraid, don't be afraid, don't be afraid. But the thing you missed is the Greek phrase right before that, ego eimi, I am. Now for us, Jesus just saying hi. Just calm down, Peter. Here I am. Don't be afraid. That's not what they would have heard with their first century Jewish ears. From Exodus, Moses said to God, I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, who is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who am. Not Popeye. I am who am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel. I am sent me to you. I am, in Greek, Elohim. In the Hebrew, Yahweh, which was the name of the Lord. That they only said once a year because it was such a sacred name, because it was the name and revelation of God. And the only person that could say that name once a year was the high priest. And the high priest would have to go through all kinds of purifications. And he would say that when he would climb into the Holy of Holies. And he would go where the Ark of the Covenant was to throw the blood of the Day of Atonement. And he would whisper the name Yahweh. And if he wasn't even worthy to say that name, he would drop dead. I told you on several occasions, they tied a rope around his legs and drug him out of the Holy of Holies if he died. If they heard a thud, sins aren't forgiven this year, and roll him out. But it was only said once. It's the name of the Lord. It means being, pure life. I am, outside of space and time. I am who was and is to come. I am. Take care. Don't worry about the waves. It is me. It is the Lord. Do not be afraid. That's what they would have heard. There's a line that also says, and Jesus meant to pass by them. For our Western ears would be like, huh? Your friends are rocking around the wave and you're just going to kind of, how you doing? You going to go over here? It's not what they would have heard with first century Jewish ears. Exodus 33. The Lord said to Moses, I will make all my goodness pass before you. I will proclaim you my name, the Lord. And while my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of rock and will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Passing by, that phraseology in the Old Testament meant a major manifestation of God, otherwise known as a theophany. That God would reveal his name, God would reveal who he was by passing by. When Scripture says Jesus meant to pass by, what a first century Jewish ears were, Jesus was revealing to them his divinity. And he uses the name of the Lord, Yahweh, I am. So Jesus in this passage in our Western ears doesn't say, I'm God, chill out, Peter, that's why I can kind of walk on the water here. But he does it in their first century Jewish context. That's why at the end of that passage in Matthew, they worshiped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. Worship was meant for God alone. No Hebrew would worship a human being only. They believed and they knew he was divine, because he was doing the things of the Old Testament. Last story, Transfiguration, which is the feast we actually celebrated yesterday. Tell me the story of the Transfiguration. We don't have a boat in this one. No boat. We got a mountain, though. We got a mountain. We have a mountain. No boat, we have a mountain. What? Clouds. Moses, Elijah, John, Peter, and James, right? So Jesus takes Peter, James, and John. Come on, boys, we're hiking up, right? Yep. He gets on the mountain, and all of a sudden he becomes transfigured. He's dazzling white. It comes from inside. It doesn't shine. It comes from inside. He becomes transfigured. They begin to freak out, and all of a sudden on either side of them appears Moses and Elijah. And Peter, because Peter never knows what to say in these circumstances, cries out, hey, this is awesome. Let's build 3 tents. One for you, one for Elijah, one for you. And all of a sudden, as he's speaking, this cloud comes over them and from the cloud comes a voice, "This is my son, listen to him." That's the transfiguration story. A lot of people say, why Moses and Elijah? People say, well, Moses is the law, and Elijah is the greatest prophet. So it's the law and prophets. And by this time, the totality of scriptures was called the law and the prophets. And so this is kind of Jesus in the midst of the prophets, right? In the midst of the Old Testament, the full law and the full prophet. But Brant here makes a neat point, and I think he's dead on. Moses and Elijah had theophanies. They saw the revelation of God, but they never got to see God face to face in their lives. We just heard that passage from Moses up above, Exodus 33, about his glory passing by, and he hides Moses in the cleft of the rock. "My face you shall not see, but you'll see my back as I pass by." Elijah, we read that earlier in the summer. There was the earthquake, there was the fire, there was the great wind, and it was only when there was the little whisper that he knew God was there until he stepped out of the cave. He never got to see him face to face, but knew he was in God's presence. They got to experience a theophany, but they never got to see God face to face. Why? Because they believed because of their sinfulness, if anyone would see God face to face, they would surely die. Here on the mountain, Moses and Elijah get to look upon Jesus. So Brant says, on the mountain of the Transfiguration, Moses and Elijah are finally allowed to see what they could not see during their earthly lives, the unveiled face of God. How is this possible? Because the God who appeared to them on Mount Sinai now became man. And Jesus of Nazareth, the one true God, now has a face. They could touch and they could see, because now love has a face. Either way, that story points to Jesus revealing his divinity. There's three accounts that we just read from those early Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. One of many to show Jesus revealed himself as divine. Still fully human. He's asleep in the boat. But fully divine, commanding the waves to stop. Either way, this is what those early evangelists believed. This idea that Jesus' divinity was dropped on him decades later does not match the internal evidence of the gospel accounts itself. And so our buddy here, Bart, in a lot of his works, talking about there's Jesus was never mentioned as divine there, is not listening to it through a first century Jewish ears. Because he was speaking it loud and clear. Loud and clear. So did Jesus think he was God? You bet he did. Did he proclaim he was God? You bet he did. In these next two sessions, we're going to look at his passion, death, and resurrection. We'll really see if he's a lunatic or a liar. And we'll look at the evidence of those two things to see how they fulfill messianic prophecy, and they stamp a big, huge yes that he is fully God and fully human.